Good morning, everyone. Ariana, are we all right to get started?
Yes, I'm good. Thank you, Jamie.
Good. Okay. Hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on what time zone you're joining us from today. I'm currently in Ottawa, Canada, so it's good morning for me. For other colleagues, I know it's in the afternoon. So, hello again. My name is Jamie Thomas, and I'm a program manager at the Forum of Federations. And welcome to the final LEGITIMULT webinar. So, thank you very much for joining us today, and thank you very much to the organizers of the webinar. Thank you very much to Ariana, who's here under LEGITIMULT Project, and to colleague Adina as well, who's not able to join us today for all of their hard work in preparing the webinar for us today. And thank you, obviously, to our speakers as well, but we'll get into that in a minute. So. Yes, thank you again for joining us for this very interesting and timely discussion on intergovernmental coordination in times of crisis, lessons from Europe and Canada. So just a few words about the project to kick us off. So LEGITIMULT is funded through Horizon Europe and the Swiss Secretariat for Education, Research and Innovation. So thank you very much to the funders and the project organizers, the work package leads, and everybody who's put in the tremendous effort for this project. It's been really tremendous to watch this project unfold. So the project began in 2022 and it's now in its final few months. And the project is focused on exploring legitimate crisis governance by examining the impact of COVID-19 and the measures taken in response to the crisis in 31 different European democracies. So with the project coming to an end, we're pleased to be here today to discuss some of these important findings and apply an international perspective with the inclusion of Canada. So having these discussions and presenting these findings are crucial now more than ever as the world continues to face an ever-increasing number of these types of challenges, but also other challenges as well. So just a few words about the forum for those of you who may not be aware of who we are in the context of this project. So the forum is delighted to be a partner of the LEGITIMULT project since its inception, supporting the work of the project. And the comparative analysis that this project focuses on is extremely useful to practitioners working in the multi-level governance community of practice. And as an international NGO specializing in federal and multi-level governance, the forum really works at the intersection of research and practice, and the knowledge produced by the LEGITIMULT project can help inform the different approaches to crisis governance in multi-level countries going forward. So the topic today is extremely pertinent to our work, and building these links with our partners in different European countries has really been something that's been incredibly useful throughout the duration of this project. So thank you to the project for providing the opportunities to do this. So a brief word on the topic that we're going to be talking about today. You're going to hear a lot more about it from our speakers, but just a few words from me to kick us off. So intergovernmental relations obviously are a key foundation of effective multi-level governance. And in times of crisis, these dynamics become increasingly visible and important. Governments at all levels have responsibilities during emergencies, from day-to-day service delivery to decision-making on containment strategies. And this may mean a higher degree of coordination and cooperation is necessary. But is this always the actual reality on the ground? And of course, having responses that are seen as legitimate are important for both citizens and the governments that the citizens elect. But what is seen as legitimate may vary depending on the context. So this is the big question that our speakers will hopefully shed some light on today. And speaking of our speakers, it's my pleasure to introduce those who will be joining us today. So I'd like to introduce you all to André Lecours, who is the Professor of Political Studies and the Forum of Federations and University of Ottawa Research Chair on Comparative Federalism at the University of Ottawa in Canada. Hello to André. Arjan Schakel, who is Professor of Comparative Territorial Democracy at the University of Bergen in Norway. Hello to Arjan. And Peter Bursens, who is Professor of Political Science at the University of Antwerp in Belgium. Hello to Peter. So just a brief note on housekeeping before we get into our substantive content for today. We will have a Q&A session at the end. So the chat function is disabled for all of our participants, but you will be able to put any questions that you have into the Q&A box. So I will be going through these Q&A questions at the end. So any questions that you have throughout the webinar, please put them into the Q&A box there. So yeah, with that, we're going to dive right into the content today. We only have a limited amount of time, so we're just going to jump right in if everybody's ready for that. So part one of our webinar today is focused on comparative insights on intergovernmentalism in Canada and Europe. So something that's kind of unique with this final webinar is we're taking some of the findings that legitimate colleagues have been doing in the European case and kind of looking at this, not necessarily comparing and contrasting, but offering a perspective from the Canadian case as well. So with that, kind of the guiding question for this session is what were some of the key dynamics of intergovernmental coordination and cooperation, or lack thereof, during the COVID-19 pandemic in your country or countries of focus for your research? And did this shape the response to the crisis? And if so, in what way? And just kind of shedding some light on these dynamics. So with that, each of you will have approximately 10 minutes to kind of shed some light on this for us. And with that, we'll kick off with Andre. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Jamie. So, for those who are less familiar with Canada as a federation, I would say that if I were to sum it up in a nutshell, the pandemic issued a brief era of cooperation, understanding that the natural state of intergovernmental relations in Canada is more competition than cooperation. So there's many reasons for that. Part of that is sociological. So there's a lot of territorial diversity in Canada. There's a strong nationalist movement in Quebec. There's what we could call a regionalist movement in at least a couple of Western provinces. There's also institutional reasons. So Canada doesn't have a democratically elected upper house that could serve as kind of this forum for provinces to communicate and then to operate within central institutions. Instead, the intergovernmental relations networks and the Canadian federations are of the so-called executive federalism model. So it's governments interacting with one another in the context of networks that are, both well established and ad hoc. It's ad hoc in the sense that governments do not meet, at least at the highest level, at kind of specific intervals. So before the pandemic, there was much conflict in intergovernmental relations in Canada. The federal government, Liberal, headed by Prime Minister Trudeau, was facing open hostility from several key provinces. In particular, those that were governed by conservative premiers. That included the largest province in the Federation, Ontario. That included Alberta, a very important province, oil producing. And Quebec is always kind of a constant in these frictions. So, and there were additional smaller provinces like Saskatchewan, which also had tense relationship with the federal government. Again, for many reasons, many of them policy related. The federal government then was implementing a carbon tax, which did not go over well in oil producing provinces and in more conservative governed provinces. The general style also would say of the prime minister kind of irked a lot of the premiers in the country. So as the pandemic starts, we have, I would say, Canadian federalism in its normal state. We have conflict between key provinces and the federal government. It's both political conflict, but it's also it goes into the legal arena because provinces are challenging federal jurisdiction, for example, on the carbon tax, and eventually lose. So we have this situation, and then the pandemic hits, and then somewhat counterintuitively, all of these signs of tensions start receding. So part of it, of course, is because there's this crisis that hits everybody, at least at the beginning, more or less the same way. But I think there's another reason. There's a sense with the pandemic that the intergovernmental relations of Canada, their natural state are not well equipped to handle such a crisis. So there's kind of behavioral change, if you will, amongst the political class. I think that's helped by the fact that we had in Canada some established network for intergovernmental relations. And during the pandemic, these networks were kept. They were utilized to their full extent. So premiers met weekly. So we've never seen in Canada such an open window into the governance of the Federation as we did during the pandemic. The premiers and the prime minister met weekly, generally refrained, at least earlier on in the pandemic, in criticizing each other. I think a direct reflection that they were kind of working together, right? Very unusual in Canadian federalism. So we have frequent meetings of the premiers and prime minister. We have more collaborative relations. And as an aside, it was very striking that we in Canada had much more collaborative intergovernmental relations during the pandemic than did our American neighbors. Of course, we had, I think, the great chance of not having a populist politician as head of government, so that helped tremendously. But again, we had also these networks, these established networks of intergovernmental relations, which I think functioned quite well. And in Canada, there's also the peculiarity in the world of federations insofar as we have political parties that are not integrated across levels of government, which means that if before the pandemic, there was kind of a partisan logic to intergovernmental relations in Canada, so conservative premiers attempting to show support to the Conservative Party of Canada at the federal level were extremely critical, even hostile towards the Liberal government. These provincial leaders were able to switch their position because the Conservative Party of Canada is not the Conservative Party of Ontario, is not the Conservative Party of Alberta, and so on and so forth. So there was a fluidity there that doesn't exist, for example, in the US, where conservative Republican governors had to side with their Republican president, and Democratic governors had to oppose essentially President Trump during the pandemic. So I think that was really useful. Now, so we went from competitive, even conflictual, actually conflictual intergovernmental relations in Canada pre-pandemic to collaborative, cooperative relations during the pandemic. But, and this is a key point here, I think we stopped short of I would say coordination. So coordination is not something that really happens in Canadian federalism, or very little of it. And the pandemic didn't really take us there. In fact, the pandemic was, I think denotes a certain Canadian exceptionalism here, because the two levels of government largely stayed in their lanes, largely stayed in their constitutionally specified powers. There's an interesting kind of recent article by Sean Mueller and Alan Fenna in Publius that explains how most federations that were kind of so-called dualist, like Canada, Australia, and the US, have become more, they call it administrative, don't overly like the term, but to denote this kind of intermingling of power and responsibility. And they say, Canada is kind of the lone exception there. It has stayed dualist the most, and that includes in the pandemic. So the federal government was busy giving cash and giving financial transfers to provinces, procuring vaccines. But really the provinces were the ones really managing the pandemic, establishing vaccine mandates, setting business hours for businesses. So the Canadian federal model, in a sense, was not changed during the pandemic. And maybe there's a limitation to that model insofar as coordination is not really part of its DNA. So I'll stop here, Jean.
Thank you. Thank you very much for that, Andre. I think that's incredibly interesting insights. And I think you picked up on a lot of things. As somebody who lived between two provinces during the pandemic, speaking to this are things I remember. I remember very well the differences between Alberta and Ontario's approach during this is interesting to hark back to. So with that, I will give the floor over to Arjan. Thank you very much, Andre. Arjan.
Yeah, thank you. And I think what I would like to discuss and present follows quite nicely on what André has been sharing with us. So within the LEGTIMULT project, I'm the principal investigator of a work package that develops a quantitative indicator of decentralization during the COVID-19 crisis in 31 European countries. One element that we have looked at is shared rule, intergovernmental relations. And the Canadian experience, so what was there in place in terms of intergovernmental relations, institutions, mechanisms before the COVID-19 crisis, was also used in the European cases, federal and regionalized countries, so Belgium, Germany, Italy, Spain, UK, and so forth. And what you can clearly see is an increase in the frequencies of meetings. However, what did they really decide? No, they didn't, except for in Germany and in Belgium, where they really coordinated these kind of restrictive measures. So restrictions. Now we'll come back to that soon. And what was very often, more often discussed and happily coordinated is what we label as redistributive policies, vaccine procurement, fiscal transfers to compensate businesses for losses incurred during the COVID-19 because of the restrictive measures and so forth, whereby subnational entities were more than happy that the national or federal government intervened because of the bag of money that they then could distribute. So what is the more interesting part of intergovernmental relations during the COVID-19 crisis is actually the extent to which national, federal governments took decisions regarding the restrictive measures and the extent to which subnational entities, subnational governments decided that. So let me now start sharing, because that's where I would like to focus upon now. That is what we have done within our work package, a quantitative development of a quantitative self-rule indicator. And that is defined as the authority of a subnational government to adopt or modify a restriction. And a restriction is a legislative rule laid down in a law, legislative decree, ministerial order, which is enforceable, it's being monitored, it's being sanctioned, and it prohibits or limits the actions of a subject, which can be a person, organizer, operator of a premise, owner of a business, and so forth. And we distinguish between 5 levels of autonomy within modifying or adopting a restriction. The highest score is when a subnational government can just freely decide. There's no national legislation that determines whether and how a subnational government can adopt a restriction, and it's clear from the Constitution or other national laws that these kind of measures being taken during epidemics or crisis can be taken by the subnational entities. A score 4 is when a national rule, either in the Constitution or in a law, organizes that kind of competence for subnational governments. Then scores 1 to 3 is really once the national government decides on a restriction, but then gives some space for subnational governments to strengthen or relax a national restriction, a score of 3. For example, we have a curfew between 10 and 12, but subnational governments can either decrease it or extend it, depending on local conditions. A targeted competence, kind of similar, but on a case-specific basis. This particular business can do that. Or business owners have to apply to a subnational government for an exemption. And then implementation, which basically is monitoring and sanction most of the cases. Now, what we have done is measured self-rule, so scores 1 to 5, according to 12 restrictions, classified, categorized according to the kind of freedom they restrict. So type A, restrictions in relation to the freedom of movement of persons. For example, stay-at-home order, a curfew, you cannot leave the house between 10 and 6, for example. Prohibitions to leave or enter the territory. You cannot travel outside this province, or you cannot enter the province. Quarantine and isolation obligations for affected persons or suspected to be affected or close contacts. You have to stay in quarantine for 40 days once you have been tested positive, for example. Then restrictions in relation to the freedom of assembly. And there we differentiate between public and private gatherings and whether they indoors and outdoors. For example, you can only have maximum gatherings of 10 people indoors, but outdoors you can gather up with 100 people. And then restrictions in relation to the freedom of to conduct commercial activities and to provide services. And then we differentiate between 5 different kind of businesses and service providers. So you have to close, you can only cater, or you can only have take home or home delivery, or you can open, but you have to make sure that social distancing is applied and so forth. So for all these restrictions, type of restrictions, subtype of restrictions, we have coded on a daily basis the authority of subnational governments to modify or adopt these kind of restrictions. That's not the only thing that we have done, because we discovered quite soon that instead of granting self-rule to subnational authorities, national government themselves said this restrictions applies in province A and another restriction applies in province B. So national governments, according to local situations in terms of the epidemic health situation, public health care capacities, differentiated territories into different categories and adopted different set of restrictions for those territories. And this is important. And I will come back to that when discussing legitimacy of the management of the COVID-19 crisis in the second part of this webinar. Then we also looked at RTV differentiation. And RTV stands for recovered, tested negatively, or vaccinated. Later in the crisis, often second half 2021, national governments started to differentiate restrictions according to whether people could present proof of a negative test result, recovery, or vaccination. For example, an organizer of a public event could host up to 10 persons, but once that organizer adopted this kind of check, then the operator could host up to, let's say, 100 people. Again, the national government determining different set of restrictions applying to one group of people vis-a-vis another group of people. And this is not territorial differentiation, it is group differentiation. Again, also important in terms of thinking about decentralization, and the effects of what type of decentralization has on the legitimacy of acceptance of restrictions. What I will present later is now some graphs whereby the scores are averaged across the 12 subtypes of restrictions, as well as territorial differentiation and RTV differentiation. And everything is assessed on a daily basis for 3 years. You can imagine, but I would like to emphasize, this research rests on a huge collection of primary sources, legislative documents, which were produced by the day, almost. So 31 countries, about 500 primary, secondary legislative documents that one needs to go through, and then writing country profiles to describe the development in the restrictions themselves, but also, and most importantly, the autonomy of subnational governments therein. Now, that's a lot of work, but then you can produce a graph like this. What you see here is on the y-axis time on the daily basis, sorry, on the x-axis, and on the y-axis, you can see the average score. Now, the solid line, I don't know whether you see my mouse going over the line, but that's the stringency, the Oxford Stringency Index. How strict were the national restrictions? This is the self-rule line over time. Now, this here is territorial differentiation, and this here is RTV differentiation, right, as explained in the legend above the graph. Looking at this graph, you can immediately see or distinguish 3 different phases. The first phase is the first half year of 2020. What you can see there is a sudden increase of very restrictive measures by the national government, which makes sense, right? Businesses were closed, curfews were, or stay-at-home orders were imposed, and so forth. And you see that self-rule is slashed. It declines dramatically. Then we have a second phase period of a year, let's roughly starting 1st of July 2020, running until the 1st of July 2021, whereby despite the fact that the national restrictions became stricter over time, especially during the winter period, of course, self-rule increased as well during the time. So national governments were giving authority to subnational governments to adopt and modify these restrictions. At the same time, they made use of this territorial differentiation that I spoke of. And then, of course, with the development of the vaccine, RTV differentiation became possible, that you can see here. That is then suddenly more widely applied, whereas self-rule remained more or less stable. What this graph hides is 2 groups of countries that are fundamentally different in the way they governed the COVID-19 crisis and what happened during self-rule before and during the crisis. Some countries had epidemic or crisis laws attuned to public health crisis. Other countries did not have that. And that's the major distinction. Countries with no pre-crisis self-rule, epidemic self-rule, and countries which had that. And then you can suddenly see that during the first phase, it's obviously the countries that had pre-crisis self-rule, that's where subnational authorities lost self-rule. Paradoxically, or at least at face validity, paradoxically, one would not think of, because one think of crisis governance means centralization of authority in central governments and in central executives particularly. That did not happen in countries with no pre-crisis self-rule. There, national authorities gained self-rule. These countries decentralized because of the crisis, because there were no requires self-rule. And the opposite then happens at the end. Once the crisis is over, those subnational authorities lose competences, whereas the ones with requires self-rule just regain their epidemic competences they had before the crisis. Now, why that is important, more on that on the legitimacy of decisions. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Ian. That's some incredibly interesting results to be presenting. Very exciting to be presenting at this session. Wow, with implications for decentralization. Thank you very much for that. And with that, we'll get into Peter. Please go ahead.
Okay, thank you, Jimmy and André and I will go into a bit more into the Belgian situation, tying into what André has already said and also what Arjan has already said. So I'll share my screen to guide you through what I want to say. I hope you can see the presentation here. Yeah, okay. So likewise as Arjan, who has been involved in work package basically on the comparative part and the data collection of shared rule, self-rule. We in Antwerp are also involved in several work packages, but the one that we were principally involved was the one on trust, and I will come back to that in the second part. I want to share some findings on the Belgian situation first in this part. So for those of you who are not that much acquainted with Belgium, very, very briefly, but it's important because it illustrates what has been said before. You know that Belgium is centrifugal federalism and basically has been transformed from a unitary state to a federal state with the explicit aim to avoid cooperation. So the whole idea of transferring Belgium from a unitary state to a federal state was to avoid that there had to be a lot of cooperation because there was so much divergence in policy preference and the other cleavages. And this ended up in a kind of competitive federalism, right? Where you, just to avoid cooperation, you have exclusive competences for the federal level and for the double subnational level, the regions and the communities. With a very particular feature, which is that there is no hierarchy between the federal level and the subnational level. But although one tried to avoid cooperation and by giving these exclusive competencies, especially to the subnational level, this of course is not absolute because there is a lot of very nitty-gritty constitutional stuff that kind of intertwines the different levels. So there is a very complex division of competencies, and policies interfere with each other. Also important, and this becomes important when I say something about André's point about parties, is that we have no statewide parties and often incongruent government majorities over the different levels. So party politics always explains a lot in Belgium, also during COVID. We do have, and this ties into Arjan's point, we do have a lot of intergovernmental cooperation mechanisms. So despite that there is this whole idea to avoid cooperation, there is the need for cooperation for IGR, intergovernmental relations, and we do have a lot of formal institutions, and parties also play a very big role in the background in an informal way. I want to take a step back here, and I hope it will become clear why I do this. Because I want to make a comparison with, I want to compare the COVID-19 pandemic as an external shock with another external factor that has a huge impact on how IGR works in Belgium, and that is Belgium's membership of the European Union. So again, despite the fact that we have this constitutional feature of Belgian federalism, there is also this European factor, and European factor simply says that the EU expects all member states, or also Belgium, to come up with one position, one negotiation position, and one representative, right? And most of the competencies, if not all the competencies that the EU works on, are divided within Belgium across the different levels. So this necessitates, despite the fact that, let's say, constitutionally, de jure, there is a competitive dual federalism installed, in the facts, in a lot of policy, because a lot of policy fields are also EU policy fields, there is a lot of cooperation. So in previous publications, we wrote about this, and we kind of argue there that the EU membership of Belgium turns constitutional dual federalism in a de facto cooperative federalism. Now, what is the relevance for COVID? Well, COVID can also be seen as a kind of external factor. It's an external shock. It's a wicked problem. It touches upon a lot of competencies that are within Belgium, as in all other member states, or many other member states divided across different levels. And this means that despite that one doesn't really want to cooperate, all these IGR was needed to be activated in a way to, in an effective way, deal with COVID. So that begs the question whether the pandemic also stimulated or provoked, if you want, some more cooperative forms of federalism. And this indeed is something that you saw in to the extent that the pandemic devolved. I must also know that there is no constitutional possibility in Belgium to call for a state of emergency. What is possible is that the Minister of Interior announces a federal state of crisis management. It's a federal executive decision there, and that puts kind of a crisis management committee in which there is both federal and regional membership in charge of decisions, right? Decisions taken by the federal interior minister and executed most often at federal and regional levels. So what happens there is actually some kind of involvement of regions and communities, but as Arjan said, that doesn't mean that they also decide. The fact that they sit together and that they meet is not the same as taking decisions together. This is what happened in the first phases through the National Security Council, where regional ministers were added, and also other fora of meetings that were activated. We had a caretaker government at the start of the pandemic in the first wave. This changed towards the end of 2020. And then also the cooperation changed to a certain extent. The governor shifted from this management committee in the National Security Council to the already pre-existing consultation committees, which is composed of the federal prime minister and the regional prime ministers and other ministers from both levels, and also from that derived into ministerial conferences, cooperation agreements, and so on. And what happened here is that there was actually a shift, and this again ties into what Arjan said, from meeting and kind of working together, cooperation, but not really coordination or joint decision making. This happened. This does happen within the consultation committee, where there are formal rules, actually veto rules for all the levels involved. And another thing that happened, a bit to the side, because we're not really discussing that here, is that federal ministerial decrees also mobilized local governments, and this has to do a lot with the differentiation that Arjan has already mentioned. The data set that Arjan developed for the project did not only discuss the self, which was stressed a bit, but also the shared role, and the scores that were given at that point reflect this change of intergovernmental relations in Belgium. This is what you see over here in the different phases of the pandemic. So to make it very, very brief, there was pre-existing IGR in Belgium. This was activated formally and also, I must say, very importantly, informally. Political parties are hugely important in Belgium, behind the scenes, in the background. Not just political parties, but especially party leaders. And Belgium is really an example of partitocracy. They kind of prepare a lot of the decisions that are formally then taken in the formal IGR fora. Parliament was completely sidelined. It was mainly executive based. It's also a very important point with respect to the governance in Belgium and in many other countries, of course. And what we saw is that at the beginning this was very smooth. There is this idea that everybody needs to do its, every level does have to do its part, that they need to work together. But when the crisis, the pandemic evolves and it becomes less severe and the vaccines are there, the politicization starts again. So there were clearly different ideas about how to tackle the pandemic. In the north, in Flanders, one had a bit the idea that the way that the Netherlands and maybe even the Scandinavian countries were dealing with it in a more relaxed way and so on was a good idea to go forward. And this was totally different in the southern part and the French-speaking part, who looked as often to the south, where it was much more top-down and limitations and restrictions. So this kind of politicization was tucked away in the first stages, but it came up again in the later stages, to the extent that in the end, when doing the evaluation of how Belgium did it internally, the conclusions were totally different, right? Not only in how to tackle it, but also on where to put the different, let's say, competencies. While in the north, it was clearly said, oh, well, we had a lot of trouble cooperating. In the end, we did, but we should avoid to do this in this way again. How can we avoid it? Well, decentralize health policies more. And while in the south, the reaction was, okay, it didn't really, it did work, but it was really hard. So one way to get it done better is the opposite, right? Not centralization, but more centralization. So the politicization and different calls became very clear at the very end. So maybe just one more minute. So what I said until now, I think really ties into what Arjan said and gives you a bit of idea about the Belgian case. But I want to say something about what André said as well. And in particular, to the article he wrote in 21 with some other colleagues, where he made a comparison between Canada, the US, and Australia. And if I read the article well, André, you said, well, there are actually three factors that explain why there was more IGR collected in the US than in Australia and Canada. And this has to do with the fact that there was a lot of conflict in the United States because of the presidential system. You mentioned it already, the vertical party integration, which you also mentioned, and not the strength, but the absence of the strength of intergovernmental arrangement. So I thought, well, let's have a look at the Belgian situation and how did that play out. Well, there was not a lot of conflict. So despite the fact that there is a lot of tensions between the different levels in the north and the south in Belgium, in terms of how to handle the pandemic, it was difficult, but there was not really a lot of conflict going on. And if you then look at the different elements that were identified in the 2021 article, of course, it's a parliamentary system. It's not a presidential system, a very executive-dominated system. So that might be a clue to understand indeed the absence of conflict. The parties, that's something very difficult for Belgium because we don't have statewide parties, right? So you might then say that there is also no vertical party integration in Belgium, but actually, despite the fact that we have no statewide parties, there is some kind of vertical integration, as the regionalist parties have to make up the federal government, right? So in that way, there are the same parties, which are regional parties, not statewide parties, are both or can be both in power at the regional level and at the national level. So there is a really multi-level party game going on there, which you then might, when there is incongruence in coalitions, lead to a lot of IGR conflict, but that was absent. So that's a bit of an outlier here if you compare it, I think, with the analysis made in that article. And finally, there were a lot of existing formal IGR institutions, a bit like in Canada, much more, I think, in Belgium, and also a lot of informal IGR in the background. So, which kind of maybe smoothed out the relations at that point in the governance of the pandemic. So I'll leave it here and indeed go into a couple of issues on legitimacy, more in particular on trust in the second part. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Peter, and thank you to all three speakers for their very interesting remarks on our first part of this webinar here. I think we're really starting to see some of the links between legitimate crisis governance between multiple countries and some of the divergences as well, which is fascinating, and one of the goals that we had set out for ourselves as organizers when we had thought about planning this webinar. So we are running a little bit behind here. So with that, I'm just going to jump right into part 2 of our webinar, which is where we're going to try to tie these dynamics into legitimate crisis governance, from intergovernmentalism and crisis management into the legitimate perceptions of this governance, the legit part of LEGTIMULT, if you will, permit me. So with that, we are going to be looking at the relationship between intergovernmentalism and the legitimacy of the COVID-19 crisis governance. So we're going to go in the same order. So Andre, Arjan, and Peter. So my guiding question for this session to kick us off is, how can IGR in federal and multi-level systems contribute to either strengthening or weakening perceptions of legitimate governance during times of crisis? So what aspects of IGR may matter to citizens in terms of perceptions of legitimate responses to these events? So without further ado, Andre, over to you.
Yeah, so that's, I think, a more complicated question, but I think certainly if I go, if I focus on the case of Canada, I have a pretty simple answer, which is kind of somewhat something I already alluded to. I think legitimacy for governing the crisis was a function of the respect of the constitutional division of powers. So the federal government did have an option to do otherwise, which would have been to invoke emergency powers. For all intents and purposes, it did not. It did towards the end in relation to, what we called here the convoy. I can come back to it in a minute, but basically for managing the pandemic, contrary to many other countries, federal or not, the federal government in Canada did not look to invoke any kind of special measures to do more. And again, the peculiarity of Canadian federalism is such that attempting to do more for the federal government would surely have resulted in decreased legitimacy for its own actions and probably for pandemic management as a whole. So I think the intergovernmental arrangements helped legitimacy from the perspective of citizens understood that each level of government was acting within its constitutional and legal purview. Now, of course, as everywhere else, lots of citizens were not happy or opposed COVID restrictions. And here, I guess there was some confusion, I think, on the part of many citizens as to, who imposed these restrictions. I mean, objectively, provincial governments impose the overwhelming majority of restrictions. The federal government, for example, stipulated mask mandates and vaccination mandates for planes, trains, things within its constitutional spheres of jurisdiction, and because they're international or interprovincial. But it didn't stop some citizens from blaming the federal government for a bunch of restrictions that were in fact imposed by provincial governments. But it could have been worse. I guess what I'm saying is that the federal government had really intervened in provincial spheres of jurisdiction and started imposing various mask mandates, restrictions, business hours. I think the legitimacy of crisis management would have been worse. So again, how legitimate was the governance of the pandemic? There's, divergence across space in Canada. Overall, I think that in most provinces, Canadian citizens were, there was not a major pushback against the measures deployed during the pandemic, with the partial exception of, Jamie's native province of Alberta. So as the pandemic developed, of course, early on, there was this surprising consensus. This is, what country am I in? I really don't recognize it. And that lasted 6, 8 months, a year. Then I guess the tone set by the federal government on measures, more than its policies, because it couldn't reach very far with policies. The federal government could not. But the tone that it adopted, and we saw the Prime Minister each and every day come to speak to the country, another novelty for Canada. You know, clearly articulated several ideas. The pandemic, of course, was real, that it was serious, that Canadians needed to restrain how they interacted with others, and so on. So there was a pushback in here in more conservative provinces like Alberta. Again, not so much against policy, but against kind of this message, right? And so, interestingly, despite the fairly rigid dualist organization of the response to the pandemic, you know, in certain provinces, it wasn't all that clear for some Canadian citizens who felt that the federal government was, in fact, very heavy-handed in the way it managed the pandemic and imposing restrictions. And that led to our famous or infamous convoy, where truckers from different parts of the country, particularly Western Canada, but other parts of the country, came to Ottawa, here, steps from my university, blocked various streets, and confined my own car to a parking lot from which I could no longer get out. So all of this to say that I think the legitimacy of pandemic response was overall good, but certainly wasn't perfect. Although I think here we're kind of beyond federalism and intergovernmental arrangements. I'm not sure that there was any kind of intergovernmental setup or even approach that could have prevented this kind of reaction to pandemic management, you know, from kind of this anti-vax, anti-measure perspective. Of course, we're very close to the US here. There's, you know, transfer of ideas, you know, policy and political learning, if you will. And so there was kind of this American influence too, of resisting COVID measures and COVID policies that kind of that penetrated the country. Not that it was absent in Europe, of course, but you could see here again, we have, you know, Canadians tend to have easy access to American media of all type. These ideas, you could see them being propagated to Canada, and for a federal government that was convinced that it should be quite strict on measures, it was immediately exposed to criticism. And so in short, for a small, I think very small, but very voiceful segment of the Canadian citizenry, management of the pandemic was deemed to be less than legitimate. But the big picture, I think, is that legitimacy was strong. Again, not because the federal government tried to do too much, not because it invoked emergency measures, because it didn't, but because, as we've said before, it just delivered lots of money, cash and grants, bought vaccines, and leaving the provinces to do the rest.
Thank you, Andre, for that. Yes, I think it'd be interesting to hear from European colleagues about some of these dynamics and whether or not they were evident in their research. I certainly do remember the confusion in the Canadian case about who was actually making these laws, and confusion from Canadian citizens about which level of government these were coming from. I think is something that's misunderstood in Canada at the best of times, and certainly in the worst of times. That comes to the forefront as well. So with that, Arjan, the virtual floor is yours.
Thank you. Yeah, I would like to emphasize when it comes down to the question of legitimacy of the governance of the COVID-19 pandemic. I would like to underline what Andrea said, that when these restrictive measures, these restrictions, were all based on a sound, solid judicial basis. Certainly, there was discussion among legal scholars whether national governments could adopt particular kind of restrictions. But very often, when those discussions arose, amendments to the legislative framework were done as to make the judicial basis solid again and appropriate again. And there are only very few instances where constitutional court said that was unconstitutional. And there was often an element of a restriction, and it was definitely always long after the final verdict came, and there was a long after the expiry date of that particular restriction. So in that sense, the damage was done. But that was only a minute proportion of the national restrictions. So when we talk about legitimacy of especially restrictive measures, we really need to think about public perception of those restrictive measures. Now, what makes the COVID-19 pandemic particularly interesting for scholars studying multi-level governance is because multi-level governance was pertinent. It had to be used. Local infection rates or infection rates that differed locally, local outburst of the COVID-19 crisis, redistribution of resources in terms of to maintain public healthcare capacities, and so forth. So it was really decentralization coupled with some centralization that was adamant, that was really necessary. And then certain trade-offs come particular to the fore during the COVID-19 crisis. And that makes the case interesting because we can test, we can empirically observe what we think about what makes multi-level governance legitimate in the eyes of citizens, whether that under this unique and extreme case, it's a kind of almost unique, the very good test empirical case to test, well, if multi-level governance is good for the legitimacy of government decisions, then it should be seen then and there. Then it should be seen during the COVID-19 crisis. Now, what are then particular things that can be empirically observed? One of the things is, well, think about a similar type of restriction. But in one case, it's adopted by a national government. In other cases, adopted by a subnational government. And we know that subnational governments tend to enjoy higher trust by citizens in general than national governments because subnational governments are closer to the people, etc. So the acceptance of and the compliance to restrictions adopted by the subnational government might be higher than those adopted by the national government. Now, Peter will have more to say about that. He's done survey experiments to test this. But Jamie, you said something very relevant here. Are citizens really aware where these decisions are taking from? Right? There are multiple instances where national governments decided on all the restrictions and also on, the territorial differentiation of those restrictions, and then tasking subnational governments with implementing and, very importantly, communicating those measures. So to what, even if citizens were aware, well, I heard this from my subnational government, I heard this from my municipality, it doesn't mean that the municipality decided that restriction. It may have been decided by the national government. Now, so this is then very interesting because multiple ways lead to Rome. So one of the benefits of multi-level governance is when you decentralize policy decision-making to subnational governments, they can attune legislation decisions towards local circumstances, right? That's one of the main benefits. Because locally elected politicians are very much aware what citizens perceive, what kind of policies they prefer, what kind of local conditions, relevant local conditions are at stake. During the COVID-19 crisis, like I said, an alternative strategy instead of self-rule, decentralization, was territorial differentiating those measures. Because access to local information is something that the national governments had, and if that was not the place, made sure that they got it, right? Asking subnational governments or hospitals or public health providers and so forth, please submit us data on infection rates, on positive test cases, on public healthcare capacities, so that we can make sure that the restrictions are differentiated such that they are more stricted where necessary and less in those territories where it's necessary and less strict in other territories where infection rates are lower and public healthcare capacities are better. Right. So this is something, and I don't know that yet, but that's something I would really like to explore with the use of the data set that we have developed. Did it make a difference? That these kind of territorial differentiation of the restrictions was done by subnational authorities or done by the national government through territorial differentiation. And a similar question can you then ask about differentiation according to a COVID health passport, right? Whether you recovered, can prove that you have a negative test result or are vaccinated. Now, another important element here is I mentioned that there's an important differences between countries with no pre-crisis self-rule and countries with pre-crisis self-rule. Another important question there is, who is the actor that exercises the self-rule? Is that an elected official, an elected mayor, elected governor, elected by the people and for the people? Or are these decisions actually taken by officials supported by the central government? For example, in France, we have prefects, departmental prefects and regional prefects. And these prefects had a lot of autonomy. They could adjust curfews. They could establish curfews. They could even establish stay-at-home orders. But these are officials appointed by the central government, elected mayors, elected regional presidents, had no power whatsoever in adopting or modifying national restrictions. So subnational governments could have the same level of self-rule, but then the actor, whether the actor was who took those decisions or who exercised self-rule was elected or appointed by the central government, that make also a difference in terms of legitimacy. Are those decisions taken by elected officials? Are these decisions more complied to? Are they more accepted, willing to be accepted than those decided by officials by the central government? So that was I wanted to say about legitimacy and governance during the COVID-19 crisis. Thank you.
Thank you, Arjan. That was certainly incredibly interesting. There's a lot to chew on and unpack there, but I think this tension is dynamic, definitely between public perceptions of legitimacy versus legality and legitimacy. I think is a really interesting tension and dynamic that we saw in a lot of different countries during this crisis and in other crises, and also, the don't shoot the messenger idea as well as it applies to multi-level governance is something very interesting to discuss as well. And with that, of course, next is Peter Bersens. Please go ahead.
Okay, can you see my screen again? All right. So let me again try to make some connections with what has been said. So in the Legitimate project, what we basically did was not really focusing on legitimacy, but on trust of citizens in layers of government to take restrictive or economic support measures. Trust being one of the elements that can define legitimacy, together with a lot of other elements. So it's not really about legitimacy, but about this element of trust within the legitimacy concept. So we look at political trust, basically, which we defined in the project, or in our work package at least, as a person's belief that political institutions will act consistently with their expectations of positive behavior. So that's what we looked at different levels. And what we did indeed was a survey, and we conducted a survey experiment in 6 countries: Austria, Belgium, Germany, France, Netherlands, and Spain. And what we did was we presented the respondents with a scenario which was very similar to COVID-19, and to make it very relevant for what our discussion is about today, we also had a focus on intergovernmental relations, which we operationalized through consultations in the survey experiment. So we have a lot of findings there. I'll just focus on a couple of those, and maybe we can go into more of them in the discussion. But let me just pick out a couple of things that might be relevant for the discussion here today. So first of all, this is interesting, I think, because we could make the comparison between trust in different layers of government, let's say in non-crisis situation and in crisis situation. And what you see here in the yellow line is what you typically see is that lower levels of government are usually trusted more than higher levels of government. Arjan also already mentioned this. But when we look at the crisis situation, and the blue line and the red line here make the distinction between restriction measures and economic support measures, is that this is quite it's not the same, right? Because the regional level, but especially also the national level, seems to be trusted a lot. This has to do, of course, with the rally around the flag effect at the very beginning. People are very fearful, and they want a leader, the leader that they not identify the most, but that they see the most, which is for many the national level, also in decentralized countries, to take the measures, and they trust them to do that. Incomes and IGR into government relations, as I said, operationalized through, as Arjan also said, I mean, you cannot escape intergovernmental relations. You cannot escape the different levels in situation crisis, because competencies are spread, and there has to be differentiation, and so on and so forth. So what we asked in the project is, what is the effect of intergovernmental relations operationalized as consultations on the citizens' trust in different levels of in times of crisis? And I'll get to some results without going into the methods here or the data. But what we found, for instance, is that so compared to decision making without consultation, citizens trust a level of government more to take restrictive measure if they know that level of government has taken that decision after consultation with other levels of government. So this is the general finding, but what is more important here is that we especially looked at the least trusted level and the most trusted level. What we find here is particularly interesting, we think, because people who indicated that the level that they trusted the least, and that could be the local level or the regional, the national level, they trust that level more in taking a particular measure if they know that this least trusted level has consulted with other levels before taking that measure. Right. So, for instance, if you are quite distrustful about the national government because you are maybe have a strong regional identification, right? But the national level takes a number of measures, lockdowns, whatever. these citizens are likely to more trust this national level that they actually distrust or trust the least to take that measure when they know that this level that they don't trust has consulted with levels that they trust more, or which can be the regional level because they identify more with regional level, and the other way around. So if you have already a lot of trust in a certain level, and you know that that level has decided a lockdown after consulting with a level that you do not, that you trust less, you tend also to trust that level that you originally trusted a lot less because of the fact that there was this consultation with other levels. So this is one of the findings, and I'll just go to the very last slide because here there are some things that I can elaborate upon very briefly since we don't have that much time. So the first that you see here is what I just said, right? So the least trusted level is trusted more after consultations, and what we think here that happens is that citizens at that point kind of look at the effect of the advantages of intergovernmental relations, right? So, for instance, if the local level has consulted with the higher level, there is this idea that there is economies of scale, there is more governance power at the higher level, and that coordinations, that more expertise comes into play. So that then you think, okay, this is going to be a measure that I can trust because it's done in a way that kind of compensates for what may go wrong at the level that I trust the least. In the opposite direction, that's the second point here. The disadvantages of IGR may be more in the minds of people. So when you are already very trusting in a certain level, and you know that this level has been consulting with other levels, then you may think, wow, why is this necessary? I really trust this level to do this, and it's going to take time. It's going to be a watered down compromise. You have to take into account other opinions that really don't matter. They should just, swiftly and quickly take serious measures because it's needed at this very urgent point in time. I jump to the fourth point, which is also interesting from an IGR perspective. This effect that I just described, those are larger in countries with less IGR experience, particularly in Spain, Belgium, and France. I explained the Belgian or discussed the Belgian situation a bit before. So what we think that happened here is that in very divided systems, in very urgent situations, severe crisis situations, the unity is more valued than in non-crisis situation. The fifth point here is that we see that citizens with high attachment are less affected by consultation. So, as I said, the consultation is appreciated, but if you identify a lot with a certain level, then you don't really care that much about consultation because you have a lot of trust, a lot of confidence in this level, which you identify a lot with. And maybe a last point, the sixth point here, is that we found that citizens who believe a level has a high impact are also less affected. So if you not only are very trustful, but you also think that this is a level that can be very very powerful and is able and has capacity to take measures that are going to be complied with, then consultation in the minds of citizens is also not helping to gain a high level of trust. So these are just some findings that we got from the data and the survey experiment that we did in our work package. And of course, just to put it in the bigger story of LEGTIMULT, the whole work package on trust is only one of the work packages. So in the end, the LEGTIMULT project, I think Jamie has mentioned this at the beginning, is about these trade-offs, right? So what the project tries to do is to identify trade-offs that make governance in multi-level systems legitimate in crisis situations. And trust is only one part. So we also looked at in the project at other issues such as the legality, the transparency, the way that experts were involved, the way that minorities were taken, or the preferences of minorities were taken into account. So in putting this all together, trust obviously is only one part, but as I said in the beginning, it's one of the constituting elements in the concept of legitimacy. So I'll leave it here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Peter, for sharing these fantastic insights on the levels of trust and how this pertains to this issue of legitimacy. This actually segues into a point I wanted to make just before the final question that I will pose to our speakers today. Obviously, this is one very small piece of a very large project that an enormous number of people have been working on for a very long time. So I would just like to point out to our audience, there is a lot of resources available online for the LegitiMult project and LegitiMult work. If you visit legitimult.eu, there is an online e-learning course, there are working papers, there's going to be an upcoming book that's published. So please go take a look at the website, stay connected via social media, looking at LegitiMult on X and LinkedIn as well to stay current with the project and to stay up to date with all of the upcoming findings and work. So just wanted to say that as well, because again, this is one small piece of a project that has a lot of really fantastic material connected to this larger question. So with that, we have now come to our final question of the webinar. So we are running up against time here a little bit. So I'm going to pose this final question to our speakers, and I'd ask that you keep your responses, brief, but still take your time to answer the question, and we will move into the Q&A. We have a couple questions. Some of them have already been covered, but with that, I will ask all three of you, and we'll just continue in the same order. So what lessons can policymakers and practitioners take from insights on intergovernmentalism and in COVID-19 crisis governance, both in terms of effectiveness and legitimacy that could potentially be applied to future crises? André.
I would say that it's probably a good idea to stay within existing federal structures, right? That even though there's a crisis, there could be cost in both efficiency and especially legitimacy in doing things outside of the normal kind of channels. Again, in Canada, I think clearly would not have worked for a more interventionist kind of federal government to occur during the pandemic. So of course, there's possibilities for innovation in the context of crisis. That often happens. But at the same time, there could be a price to pay in terms of how citizens view the legitimacy of political action if it departs too radically from, I would say, the rules and the traditions of the federal state. So that's what I would say.
Thank you for that, André. Some wise words there. Arjan.
Yeah. This is a very difficult question to answer, of course, in such an abstract way. But the crucial point is exactly the trade-off between effectiveness and legitimacy, which at certain times can how do you say this? Not reinforce, but contradict each other. So citizens are obviously concerned with an effective response to a crisis. So they want to have an effective response. And an effective response means, for example, during the COVID-19 crisis, territorial differentiation. But then at the same time, citizens may think, why can I not move out of the house, whereas my neighbors, just living 2 blocks away, can go out of the house purely because there is a provincial border in between my house and their house, right? And then, legitimacy in terms of acceptance of the decisions declines rapidly. What I can say or dare to postulate is that a local or an effective response, which is important for legitimacy as well, requires the flexibility of locally adapting the response, no matter how you do it, either through self-rule or territorial differentiation. But it can easily make the complexity very it increases complexity, especially when you change the response, you change the restrictions, etc., on a weekly basis. And then, according to 300 municipalities, I have piles of legal documents, and I struggle making sense of it, let alone that citizens and the ones who have to implement it. So locally adopt. So to answer one of the questions, what systems should do? Be flexible in terms of locally adjusting the measures. What they should, and in coordination between national and subnational governments. What they shouldn't do is make it too complex, and that's why the coordination is so important. That, for example, national and subnational governments decide, yes, we allow local adjustments, but we have just 3 varieties to make things not too overly complex.
Thank you, and yeah, some really good points there. And thank you for weaving in some of the questions into your response to the final question. Very well done. We'll go to Peter.
Yeah, very briefly. Also, because there is a whole document produced by colleagues in Legitimate with policy recommendations. So maybe let me just point out and stress also what Arjan said, which is the trade-off between effectiveness and legitimacy. But let me bring in the element of time. I think indeed this is true, but the idea of effectiveness is really something that plays a lot at the very beginning when the crisis is very acute. And I think that at that point, some centralization is really accepted by citizens, right? Because they want to be safe, right? They want policies to keep them safe. They would, I think, trust the policies more indeed if they know that they are taken after consultation and cooperation, because then there is more expertise and so on that comes on board, especially cooperation with between the national level and the regional level. But then to bring in the element of time, when the crisis becomes less severe, there are solutions, vaccines, and so on, and other policies. Then indeed the differentiation and the decentralization becomes important, and certainly when it comes to the implementation measures that need to be taken. So the trade-off kind of is different in the different stages of the policies, and I think that indeed this is something that that policymakers, on top of so many other things, think about communication and other things that are very important, that come into the picture here in terms of time. So I'll leave it at that.
Thank you for that, Peter, and thank you to all 3 of our speakers for answering a very, very difficult final question, trying to encapsulate a very broad question into a very succinct response. So thank you for that. I think most of the questions that we had in the chat actually have been answered in one way or another by all 3 of you during your response here. I'm just taking a look to see if there's any that kind of escaped your final responses. Maybe one here that kind of escaped is part 2 of a question that Liam had asked. So how can policymakers implement and maintain a response seen as legitimate when conditions in different parts of a country might be very different and evolve over time? For example, COVID infection rates being much higher in one region than another. So I think this gets to a point that was mentioned kind of tangentially at certain points, but how do you deal with this from a central level? I think we saw this. We did see this at some points in Canada where certain provinces were opening up at higher rates than others, and people were upset about this. And it'd be interesting to hear if maybe this was the case in different European contexts as well. And then maybe at the same time, a question more specifically to André. So did the exercise of self-rule during COVID reinforce political provincial identities, i.e. in Quebec and Alberta? And how did this shape public perceptions of legitimacy and trust in governmental decisions? So maybe I'll open the floor to whoever would like to take the question 1, and question 2 I think is more directed to André. So please jump in.
Well, I can at least offer a reflection on this, because it's a question about legitimacy of the citizens within the jurisdiction that has decided to open up vis-a-vis the citizens and their perspective on legitimacy in jurisdictions that have stricter measures, right? So what is the source of dissatisfaction? Is the source of dissatisfaction that they feel treated unequally, but by whom then? By their subnational government or by the federal government? By the fact that the two subnational governments did not cooperate and collaborate in coordination? So I find it a bit difficult to then say, okay, what needs to be done? Because we need then to know a bit more what is the source, the real source of dissatisfaction here that gives then rise to a decreased or increased legitimacy for whom?
Yeah, absolutely. I think in this instance it may be kind of that pull towards more of a centralized response because citizens are being treated differently in different parts of a country, where there's this desire for, yes, we want tailored opportunities, but we also want to be treated the same. So I think this tension that you were speaking about earlier kind of comes to the forefront when we're discussing these kinds of dynamics. So it's interesting to think about.
Another thing is, it may be there may be very good justified reasons in terms of academic response to have this differentiation.
Absolutely.
Right? Because all the legal documents say an action needs to be proportionate. Right?
Yes.
So to the extent if the restrictive measures were always adjusted towards local infection rates and public health capacities, either within a jurisdiction or in a collection of jurisdictions or in the statewide territory as a whole. And this was always the ground for, and governments were always required to provide this kind of justification before adopting these measures. So from a functionalist, we call that the functionalist perspective, which is also important for legitimacy because citizens also want effective policy responses, right? So maybe then, it's about more clearly communicating why one province is opening up and the other provinces is not opening up. And when it boils down to party politics, right, the reason to accept that situation might be much lower than when, you can point out, well, here infection rates are clearly higher than there.
Yes, absolutely. That communication piece, I think, is a critical thing to come out from this. And the point about party politics, I think, segues into the question that perhaps Andre can shed a little bit of light on. Andre?
Yeah, thanks, Ari, for your question. I think it's probably fair to say that the respect of self-rule during the pandemic probably contributed to strengthening it. Not that it needed any more strengthening, probably in Canada. But what I would say the pandemic did that was more significant was, and maybe, Peter could give us a sense if this happened in his very comparable Federation of Belgium, but in Canada, it gave some relevance to the federal government that's often seen as being very far, right? Because the federal government in Canada does not, make education policy, doesn't make healthcare policy. It makes a little bit of social policy, but not all that much. So everything that touches Canadian citizens is really, the purview of the provinces. But here in this crisis situation, I think Canadians saw the federal government much more than probably they ever did in their lifetime. So that was a change. And incidentally, now Canadian citizens are still seeing the federal government in the context of this crisis with the US. So it's been 7-8 years of Canadian citizens seeing the federal government do things in a way that we're really not used to.
I might briefly add a few words on Belgian case, as André mentioned.
Oh, absolutely. Sorry. Go ahead, Peter.
Sorry, yeah. I think the situation, of course, there are comparabilities between the Canadian and the Belgian system, but the federal level is very visible also in non-crisis situations in Belgium. So I think that's a big difference. And during the during the pandemic, despite the fact that it was all about businesses and schools and so on, which is actually competence of the subnational level. It was the federal prime minister, and much more even the experts of the federal advisory committee that were in the picture, to the frustration, I would say, of the subnational government leaders. So in that respect, it was quite different in Belgium, I would say.
And
Awesome.
if there's still time, then
yeah, we've got just 1 minute.
so what became more visible was the coordination that took place. So, for example, in Germany, the federal and the land prime ministers met to decide upon the restrictions. These minutes of these meetings were kept secret, as usual, but they had to be published. There was a court order to make the decision list published. So that became much more visible, the coordination between levels of government. And this often takes behind closed doors, and only through press releases and press conferences, this information comes out. But, and here again, the trade-offs come back in. As soon as there is this obligation to publish the minutes of these meetings, intergovernmental meetings, the politician starts to think about everything that I will say now will be published. And then it opens up to a blame-shifting game. That also happened during the COVID-19 crisis. And probably André will have much more to say about that on that topic. But again, transparency, good. On the other hand, trade-off, you get calculating politicians, that impacts their behavior and the decisions.
Of course. Awesome. I think we could probably go on for a lot more time speaking on this topic, and I certainly would like to. And it's my hope that these conversations continue offline, as I think we all do, and I think that they should. But with that, I would like to close this webinar today. I would request that all of the speakers just stay on after I close the webinar just to take a quick photo. So just please stay on for 1 minute afterwards. But with that, I would sincerely like to thank all of the organizers today. I would like to thank Ariana for her efforts in getting all of this organized today, and Adina as well, who was not here. So thank you very much for all of the work that you put into getting this organized. I'd also like to thank my colleagues at the forum, especially Liam, who covered for me while I was on vacation and helping to get this organized as well. And thank you to all of our speakers who took time out of their schedules to be here today and to share their research with us. It was really fantastic. And I think sharing these lessons, again, as I said at the beginning, now more than ever, these lessons don't just apply to the pandemic. These lessons apply to multi-level governance dynamics as we see them happening in real time today. So thank you again. This has been very enlightening for me and my work, and I'm sure for all of our attendees as well. And thank you to our attendees for joining us this morning, this evening, this afternoon, wherever you may be today. And my final thank you is to LEGITIMULT, to all of the work package leaders, all of the contributors, and to the funders, Horizon Europe, as well as the Swiss Secretariat for Education, Research, and Innovation.